The rain descended in relentless waves, crashing against the cracked sidewalks of Houston's Fifth Ward. It wasn't the kind of gentle drizzle that whispered against rooftops. It was a violent storm, soaking the streets in cold despair. A lone street lamp flickered, its dying light casting long, restless shadows over the broken pavement. The city breathed in silence, but beneath its surface, a war raged. One fought not with gloves, but with fists hardened by hunger and desperation. In a forgotten alley, a teenage boy stood, fists clenched, muscles tight, breath slow and steady. His clothes were damp, clinging to his lean frame, but the cold didn't bother him. The fire inside was hotter than any storm. His eyes, dark and hollow, burned with something deeper than rage, something primal, something that had been forged through years of survival. George Foreman wasn't afraid of the night. He ruled it. He prowled these streets like a predator without a pack, a king with no kingdom. He wasn't born into privilege. He wasn't raised with gentle hands or kind words. The world had only taught him one lesson. If you're weak, you don't survive. And Foreman refused to be weak. He learned to fight before he learned to dream. His battleground wasn't a canvas stretched inside a boxing ring. It was the unforgiving streets, where every punch thrown carried weight, where every fight was for respect, for survival, for another day above ground. Life hadn't given him a choice. He had to be ruthless, had to be unbreakable. The bruises, the scars, the broken bones, none of them mattered. What mattered was never backing down. What mattered was standing tall when the world tried to break him. But somewhere, deep beneath the hardened scowl and the clenched fists, there was still a boy who had yet to understand what true strength really meant. The world would soon find out. The world first witnessed his power beneath the scorching Mexican sun. The year was 1968, and George Foreman wasn't just another boxer. He was a storm waiting to be unleashed. Clad in the bold red, white, and blue of the United States, he stepped onto the grandest stage of his life, the Olympic boxing ring. Across from him stood a colossus, a Soviet powerhouse who had crushed every opponent in his path. But Foreman didn't feel fear. He had fought his entire life, not for medals or applause, but for survival. His stance was raw, his technique unpolished, but when his fists found their mark, the world trembled. Every punch carried the weight of the streets he had come from. His opponent, once towering and indomitable, began to crumble like a brittle fortress under siege. The final blow was an exclamation point. A shot so brutal it sent the Soviet crashing to the canvas like a fallen titan. The referee's count echoed through the air, but the fight was already over. Silence turned into chaos. The crowd erupted, cameras flashed, history was made. As the referee raised his hand in victory, the arena roared, but he barely heard them. The world saw triumph. He only felt hunger. It wasn't the hunger for food. He had known that all his life. This was something else. A hunger to be feared, to dominate, to prove, not just to his opponents, but to himself, that he was more than just another kid from the gutters of Houston. As the gold medal was draped around his neck, Foreman didn't smile. He wasn't satisfied. He didn't crave their admiration. He didn't care about the cheers, because in his heart, he knew this was only the beginning. The world had just witnessed the birth of something terrifying. A monster had been unleashed. Descending from the Olympic podium, George Foreman carried more than just gold. He carried the weight of something far greater. He wasn't stepping into a life of fame and fortune. He was walking into war. The professional ranks awaited, a world even more ruthless than the streets he had conquered. There were no second chances here, no mercy, only fists and fury. He entered the heavyweight division like a wrecking ball, a force that didn't just defeat opponents, he obliterated them. His punches weren't just powerful, they were catastrophic. Bones cracked, wills shattered, careers ended. One by one, fighters fell like dominoes, unable to withstand the sheer force of Big George. They called him unstoppable. They called him unbeatable. But Foreman didn't care what they called him. He wasn't fighting for their praise. He fought because the fire inside him demanded it. In those early years, he was a storm with no direction. His rage was unchecked, a wildfire consuming everything in its path. He bulldozed his way through contender after contender, an executioner in boxing gloves. It wasn't just about winning, it was about destruction. The world marveled at his power. Commentators spoke in awe of his ferocity. Trainers whispered his name with fear. His knockouts were brutal, his victories absolute. But with each conquest, something inside him grew darker. The more he won, the angrier he became. The more he conquered, the emptier he felt. No matter how many opponents he destroyed, no matter how many men lay broken beneath his fists, it was never enough. Because deep down, the one thing he couldn't knock out, the one opponent he had yet to face, was himself. But the world didn't see that. All they saw was an unstoppable force, a nightmare in the heavyweight division. And soon, that nightmare would come face to face with destiny. A championship, a king to dethrone, a moment that would define him forever. The contract was signed. The world braced itself. An unstoppable force was about to collide with an immovable object. It was 1973, and the heavyweight throne belonged to Joe Frazier, a warrior baptized in fire, the man who had conquered Muhammad Ali, the undisputed champion of the world. He was a relentless machine, a battering ram who fought with savage intensity. But across from him stood something different, something terrifying. George Foreman wasn't just another challenger. He was a walking apocalypse, a man whose fists didn't just land, they detonated. The venue, Kingston, Jamaica. The world watched as the two men stepped into the ring, one a battle-hardened warrior, the other an uncaged beast. Frazier, the champion, was a symbol of resilience, but Foreman, he was destruction incarnate. The bell rang. Foreman wasted no time. He came forward like a war machine, fists blazing, unleashing hell. The crowd barely had time to process what was happening before Frazier was lifted off the canvas by a thunderous uppercut. He crashed down. The referee counted, but Frazier wasn't done. He stood, shaking the pain from his bones, ready to fight. Foreman sent him down again, and again, and again. 6 times Frazier fell. 6 times he tried to rise, but it was no use. The storm was too strong. The destruction was too complete. The referee had seen enough. The fight was over. In just 2 brutal rounds, George Foreman had done the impossible. He had annihilated the indestructible. The heavyweight division had a new king, and his reign would be one of fear, devastation, and dominance. As the championship belt was strapped around his waist, Foreman stood in the center of the ring, expressionless. Not in awe, not in celebration. Because this was never about a belt, never about a title. It was about proving that no man on earth could stand against him. And for a time, that was true. The world of boxing had never seen dominance like this. George Foreman wasn't just a champion, he was a nightmare given form. Other fighters held titles, other men defended belts, but Foreman, he enforced his rule with brutality. His presence alone sent fear rippling through the division. His knockouts weren't just victories, they were executions. He didn't win fights, he ended them. His first challenger, Ken Norton. A man who had done the unthinkable. He broke Muhammad Ali's jaw. If anyone had the resilience to withstand Foreman, it was him. But Norton never stood a chance. Foreman didn't just beat him. He dismantled him in 2 rounds. Norton crumbled under the assault, unable to breathe, unable to fight back. The message was clear. Big George wasn't just champion, he was untouchable. And yet with each victory, something inside him grew darker. The more he fought, the more he realized he didn't crave glory, he didn't seek admiration. He didn't care about being loved. He wanted to be feared. And fear, he discovered, was a drug. The more he had, the more he needed. He walked the earth like an executioner, his fists serving as judge, jury, and punishment. He barely celebrated his wins. He barely acknowledged the crowds. The world bowed before him, and yet he felt nothing. But the hunger remained, the thirst for something greater. Then came the challenge. A voice from the past, a legend who refused to fade. Muhammad Ali. The world had written him off. They said he was finished. They said he was walking into a slaughter. But Ali had a plan. He always did. And soon, Foreman would find himself in the heart of a storm, unlike any he had ever faced. A battle that would change his life forever. The world called it the Rumble in the Jungle, Zaire, 1974. The undefeated juggernaut, George Foreman, against the legend, Muhammad Ali. Foreman was younger, stronger, and deadlier. The oddsmakers had already decided. Ali was finished. He was past his prime, walking straight into destruction. But Ali wasn't just a fighter. He was a master strategist, a warrior who fought not with brute force, but with his mind. From the moment Foreman landed in Zaire, something felt off. The people, the energy, the chants in the air. Ali Bomai, Ali Bomai. Kill him, Ali. Foreman had never felt doubt before. Now, for the first time, it crept into his bones. The bell rang. Foreman charged like a war machine. He unleashed his full arsenal, each punch carrying the weight of a wrecking ball. The ring trembled, the ropes shook, but Ali didn't fall. He leaned back. He absorbed the storm. He whispered taunts into Foreman's ear. Round after round, Foreman swung. But Ali refused to break. Foreman was used to men crumbling beneath his power. But Ali was doing something different. He was waiting. And then, in the 8th round, the world tilted. Ali, fresh as if the fight had just begun, struck like lightning. A blinding combination, a perfect right hand. And for the first time, George Foreman felt the earth slip from beneath him. He went down, flat on his back, eyes staring at the night sky above Zaire. The referee counted. 6, 7, 8. He tried to rise, but his legs betrayed him. 9, 10. It was over. The king had been dethroned. Muhammad Ali stood in triumph, arms raised to the heavens. The world erupted in hysteria. And George Foreman? He lay in silence, drowning in the bitter realization that he had been outthought, outlasted, and outclassed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the destroyer. He was the destroyed. And nothing would ever be the same again. George Foreman left Zaire a broken man. The aura of invincibility that once surrounded him had been shattered. The whispers began. Maybe he was never that great. Maybe he was just a bully who finally met a man he couldn't bully. But Foreman wasn't done. He tried to claw his way back. 1976. He stepped into the ring with Ron Lyle, a man just as vicious, just as relentless. The fight was carnage. They traded knockdowns in a brutal war, fists flying, bones cracking. Foreman fell. Lyle fell. But in the end, George stood victorious. Yet even as his arm was raised, the victory felt hollow. Winning didn't feel the same anymore. The ghost of Zaire still loomed over him. Then came Jimmy Young, 1977. A fight that should have been routine. But Foreman wasn't the same. His power remained, but something inside had dimmed. The fight dragged on. Young was quick, elusive. He frustrated Foreman, made him miss, made him doubt. The final bell rang. Foreman had lost again. But that wasn't the real defeat. What came next was something no punch could prepare him for. In the locker room, his body collapsed. His breath came in ragged gasps. His vision blurred. The world around him faded. Then came the abyss. A darkness unlike anything he had ever known. He felt himself slipping, falling. A bottomless void opened beneath him, and voices, whispers of despair, of doom, pulled him deeper. This wasn't exhaustion. This was death. And for the first time in his life, George Foreman, the destroyer of men, the breaker of wills, felt powerless. He had spent his life fighting, but now he could not fight this. In his final moment of surrender, he reached for something he had never truly sought before. God help me. And just like that, he came back, gasping for air, eyes wide with terror. George Foreman sat up. His trainers and doctors surrounded him, their faces twisted in worry. But George, he wasn't the same man anymore. George Foreman had fought battles in the streets. He had waged wars in the ring. But nothing had prepared him for the war inside himself. The locker room incident had shaken him to his core. He wasn't afraid of losing. He was afraid of what he had seen. That abyss. That darkness. The feeling of slipping away into something he couldn't fight, couldn't control. And in that moment of helplessness, when he had nothing left, he had found something. Not a punch, not a title, but faith. Foreman walked away from boxing. No farewell fight, no grand exit. Just silence. The cameras stopped rolling. The headlines moved on. But his battle had only just begun. The man who once ruled the ring now stood behind a pulpit. He preached redemption. He spoke of second chances. The voice that once growled threats now carried messages of hope. The world laughed. Big George Foreman, a preacher. Impossible. They had seen him crush men with his fists. Now he spoke of love, of peace. And yet Foreman had never been more certain of anything in his life. But transformation doesn't come without struggle. The millions he had earned, gone. The fortune he had crushed men for, vanished. Foreman, once a king, now struggled to put food on the table. His ministry was his purpose, but purpose alone wouldn't feed his family. And so he faced a question he never thought he'd have to answer. What now? For years, he had sworn he would never return to boxing. That part of his life was over. But when his children looked up at him with hungry eyes, when the bills piled up higher than his pride, at 38 years old, George Foreman made a decision that sent shockwaves through the world. Big George was coming back. The world mocked him. Experts laughed. He's too old. He's too slow. This is a joke. But what they didn't know was that George Foreman had already been to hell and back. And this time, he wasn't fighting for money. He wasn't fighting for fear. He was fighting for redemption. The boxing world is cruel. It doesn't welcome old warriors. It devours them. When George Foreman announced his comeback, the reaction was savage. He's lost his mind. He'll embarrass himself. He'll get hurt. The same media that once feared him now mocked him. The same fans who once roared for his knockouts now laughed at his age. But Foreman wasn't here to prove his strength. He was here to prove his will. The first few fights were met with ridicule. He looked different now, thicker, slower. He didn't move like the destroyer of the past, but when the bell rang, the power was still there. One by one, he silenced the doubters. The knockouts returned. The whispers faded. The world hesitated. Maybe this wasn't a joke after all. But critics still clung to their doubts. He's not fighting real competition. He's just padding his record. Foreman ignored them. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing something deeper. And then the moment arrived. A title shot. A chance to reclaim what was once his. A fight against Michael Moorer, the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world. Foreman was 45 years old. Moorer was in his prime. Young, fast, powerful. The odds makers didn't just count Foreman out. They dismissed him entirely. He's too slow. He won't land a punch. He's walking into his own destruction. But what they didn't understand was that Foreman had nothing left to fear. November 5th, 1994. The bell rang. Moorer dominated early. He snapped crisp jabs into Foreman's face, dancing around him, making him look every bit his age. Foreman was too slow to chase him down, too plodding to land anything clean. But he didn't panic. He didn't waver. He had learned patience. He had learned that fights aren't always won in the first round, or the second, or even the eighth. Then came the 10th. Moorer had grown comfortable. He thought he had the fight won. And that's when Foreman struck. A single right hand, short, compact, and devastating. It was exploded into Moorer's jaw. The champion's legs buckled. His body crumbled to the canvas. His title slipped away before his very eyes. The referee counted. Michael Moorer could not rise. The world stood in stunned silence. George Foreman, against every odd, against every doubt, was heavyweight champion of the world. At 45 years old, he had just done the impossible. As the belt was wrapped around his waist, Foreman sank to his knees. The crowd roared. The commentators scrambled for words. And Big George, he simply smiled. Not the scowl of the young, angry destroyer he once was, but the smile of a man who had, after decades of war, finally found peace. There comes a point in every fighter's life when the cheers fade, the lights dim, and the world moves on. But George Foreman never needed the world's applause. He had walked through fire, been broken, rebuilt himself, and done the impossible, not once, but twice. He had conquered fear. He had conquered doubt. But most importantly, he had conquered himself. With the heavyweight championship back around his waist, the world demanded more. One last defense. One last war. The new generation smelled blood. They wanted to take his crown. Foreman, the aging king, could have fought on. The paydays were massive. The headlines were his for the taking. But for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to prove. He had silenced every critic. He had erased every doubt. He had reclaimed his throne. Now, he was ready to walk away. This time, for good. The gloves came off. The fight was over. But as Foreman was not done fighting. He fought for something greater now, not titles, not money, not fear, but legacy.